Guys, we're going to move on to something a bit more complex now. We're going to start looking at this concept here, which is the concept of logical fallacies. Logical fallacies, in a nutshell, are improper uses of logic that lead to wrong conclusions. That's the best way to explain it. And you can kind of break it down by looking at the concept here, logic and fallacy, which means error, not true, falsehood. That's what fallacy means. One thing I am going to say from the outset is sometimes I get really confused because, to tell you the truth, I think a logical fallacy should actually be classified as a cognitive bias, because even though it is a misuse of logic, it fits more in the category of we've taken some mental shortcut and we haven't really even applied logic. But what you need to understand is that what could be seen as a cognitive bias has been, according to the philosophical canon, termed as a logical fallacy, and you just got to get used to that. Okay, so what are our success criteria? Well, we need to name and define what a logical fallacy is. Then we need to name and define what types of logical fallacies exist. And then we need to identify examples of different types of logical fallacies. So we need to provide examples. Write these down, score yourself out of 4 on each of them, and then your APK will be to draw a picture of your face when you hear someone argue something completely illogical. The logic is wrong, and therefore the conclusion they generate is wrong. All right, so what is a logical fallacy? What's a proper definition of one? Well, again, the way to kind of really encapsulate the definition in a nutshell is to say a logical fallacy is a wrong use of logic. It's what happens when you use logic in the wrong way, and as a result you come up with an erroneous conclusion. Take a note. So here I've said the same thing again. It's an incorrect use of logic that usually leads to a erroneous conclusion. Again, just check to see if your notes are accurate and you wrote that down. Now, why do we actually commit logical fallacies? Why are human beings guilty of logical fallacies? That's probably the best term. Well, it's probably because we weren't really wired to be aware of how we engage in logic when we do it. And it's probably because we're not really wired to dissect and understand the proper use of logic when we're trying to engage in it. How does logic actually work? It's not something that we're wired to analyze innately, like we are when it comes to picking up language. Take a note. That said, though, I do believe human beings are wired to be able to learn proper logic, but we're not born with an ability to use it straight away. Take a note. And because we don't dissect it and understand how it works, well, we don't really have the ability to correct ourselves unless we've trained ourselves. So I'm going to say it again. We have the ability to use it, to learn it, but we're not born with it. Take a note. And I think because we're not actually conscious of it when we're doing it, we don't really reflect on whether or not we've committed logical errors. Take a note. All right, so if you're not trained in using logic, then you're going to commit errors. And a lot of these errors can be categorized as logical fallacies. Take a note. The first one I want to talk about is quite difficult. Now, the ones that I'm actually going to talk about are the ones that you must know and you must understand. But there are so many more. In fact, there's probably an infinite amount of them available. But these 3 ones are probably the most formulaic. And what I like about these 3 ones is that it's really easy to see how logic has been used incorrectly, because they're really based on getting logic wrong in a particular key step of arguing something, right? Whereas the other ones I'm going to send you away to research by yourself, I actually think they fit very closely sometimes into cognitive biases, though fallacies of equivocation are straight out logical fallacies. They're not really cognitive biases, but you'll have a look later. All right, so the first one is the affirming the consequent. Now, what does that mean? Let's just write this down. Consequent is after in a premise. Take a note. All right, so formula. If A, then B. Object A is the first object, and we're going to call it A. And then the second one is B. We're going to call it B. A is what we call the antecedent because it comes before, and B is what we call the consequent because it comes after. Take a note. So in this case, car, and probably filling up with gas, but mainly the car, is what we call the antecedent. And not being able to move is what we call a predicate. Take a note. It's also what we call the consequent, the cat not being able to move. Take a note. Now, the reason why this predicate subject logic is really important is that in grammar, we're starting to see how grammar and philosophy really relate. See, what's really important is that when we have a subject in a sentence, that subject is actively performing an action. Take a note. Subjects actively perform an action. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about is the fact that some of those actions can be a form of existence, or they can be a descriptive quality, like Mr. Ross is a human male. So I'm engaged in the action of existing as a human male. So I'm the subject and the predicate is existing as a human male, right? And the B, in this case, can be a predicate because it explains what A is doing. So let's have a look at this if then A then B statement. If a car has no gas, then it doesn't move. In this case, the subject is the car because it is the active thing in the premise. And the action is having no gas and not moving. Yeah? So we've actually got two predicates and objects, but I'm not even going to go there, man. I'm not going to go there. Just understand that B is the predicate or the object and is being used to describe the subject, which is performing an action, which is having no gas and not moving. Okay? Take a note. Now that sounds incredibly complex, but you need to get this in order to understand why later on when we call the fallacy of the undistributed middle, why that works that way. All right, but for now, we need to understand that we've got the term first, which is A, and the term second, which is B. And this is called an antecedent, which comes before, and this is called a consequent, which is the result of A, and it comes last, right? Now, here is where the logical fallacy or the bad use of logic starts. If we affirm the consequent, which means we say the consequent or B happened, we cannot therefore go ahead and say that A happened. That's a logical error. Take a note. Now, let me explain it using this example. If a car has no gas, the car won't move. The car is not moving, therefore the car has no gas. That's a logical error. Write that down. Write the example down. Now let me explain what's actually happened here. I'm saying if the car has no gas, it won't move. And then I'm affirming the consequent, which is in this case it won't move, or B, and I'm saying B happened. That means I'm affirming the consequent. So therefore the car is not moving. And I'm then using the fact that I believe because the car isn't moving, the car has no gas. It's illogical to say that A happened, right, if B happened. Take a note. So, affirming the consequent is when you say just because you observed B, therefore A happened. And that's wrong. Why? Because we know there are many, many reasons for why the car didn't start or why the car didn't move. It could have broken down. It could have had a busted axle. It could have had a broken solenoid. It could have had so many other reasons for not starting, right? So we know that A is not the only cause of B. And just because we observe B doesn't mean So we know, therefore, that yep, A isn't the only cause of B. And just because we observe B doesn't mean that A happened. There could have been a multiple amount of other causality, all right? So making conclusions based on affirming the consequent is a logical fallacy. Take a note. The next thing to say, though, is if we do the reverse, which is affirm the antecedent, we actually have a logical argument. What do I mean by that? Well, it is actually correct to say quite easily, if the car has no gas, unless it's, of course, it's electric, so let's just change this. If the gas-fueled car has no gas, therefore it won't move, right? We observe that the gas-fueled car has no gas, therefore the car won't move. And that's actually quite logical. So if we affirm the antecedent and then conclude the consequent, then we actually have a logically valid or cogent argument. And this is what we call an argument that meets the criteria of modus ponens. Take a note. So while affirming the consequent is illogical, affirming the antecedent and making conclusions from that is logical. Take a note. All right, now let's look at the opposite. The opposite example of this fallacy is what we call the denying the antecedent. Now remember, the first term is the antecedent, the second term is the consequent, all right? Now, let's say you've got a super awesome dog, a hypothetical dog, and this dog has been trained only to bark when there's intruders. It never barks for any other reason, okay? So we could logically therefore say if A, then B, or if the dog is barking, then there is an intruder, okay? Then we can start committing an error of logic, which is what a logical fallacy is. Right, we didn't observe A, which is denying the first term above the antecedent. Therefore, there is no intruder, okay? And for all we know, the dog wasn't there, or the intruder gave him lots and lots of sausages, and he's just too distracted. Oh, I love this guy. He gives me sausages. He's my friend, okay? So what we've got is this scenario that we've concluded that there is no B because A did not happen. And like we said before, there could be many other causes of B, or many other reasons for why B is there. So, again, how do we know that the dog wasn't going for a walk? How do we know that the dog wasn't distracted by food? We don't know that. The intruder could still be there. So when you say that the antecedent didn't happen, therefore the consequent didn't happen, that's in a logical conclusion. It's wrong. That's what we call denying the antecedent, or denying the first term. Take a note. Now, you've probably figured out that you can make a logical argument using the reverse, which is that if you make conclusions based on denying the consequent, it is valid or or cogent. What do I mean by that? Okay, so what's the consequent term here? All right, the dog only barks when it sees an intruder, right? Let's deny B because it is the consequent, so there is no intruder, therefore the dog isn't barking. That is a purely logical argument that follows modus tollens. Take a note. Right, now I've found that these two are, even though they're rather complex because they're full of abstractions and formulas and explaining why and stuff like that, they're probably a little easier to explain than this next one. But this next one is actually probably the one that you would come across the most in English, and you come across the most almost all the time. And it's what we call the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Take a note. All right. Now, in a categorical syllogism, we have that typical Venn diagram. If all A's are B's and all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. And again, how do we represent that in a Venn diagram? Well, you've seen me do it before, so let's pick my circle. You know, the big one is going to be, we're going to call that C, right? You get where we're coming from, guys? Actually, no, I will add a comment. That's good. I like a comment. C. Ooh. and then we're going to add another circle. I'm going to call that shrink you. Get rid of you. I'm going to call this one B, right? And then in the middle we've got A's, right? I'm just going to pause this and set it up so you can see it really quickly. All right, so there you go, set it up really quickly. So here you go. If all A's are B's and all B's are C's, bang, we know that all A's are C's. It works in the Venn diagram. That's what we call a categorical syllogism, because we're performing the act of categorizing. It's completely deductive, so it's a syllogism and it works really well, okay? What happens is when we actually analyze this again for the grammar, we've got what we call major terms, minor terms, and middle terms. Again, when I was talking about predicate and subject, that's where we really have to understand how this fallacy can happen. So A is the first major term of premise 1. And what it does is it performs the action of being a subject, all right? And so we're saying if all A's are B's, so it's performing the predicate of being B, right? Then we could say, and all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. What's really important is that we've got the right A and we've got the right B, okay? And then we've got a minor term here, which is the C's. And then we've got this term here, the B, which is the middle term. And it's the term that has been distributed across both premises. B's here and B's there. Take a note. Now, what's really important is that when you're talking about the right distributed term, the right distributed term has to be the predicate, okay? If you've written it incorrectly and you've got the predicate wrong, your argument is actually illogical. And that's kind of demonstrated here by the formula for the undistributed middle. So we've got if all A's are B's and all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. So that makes sense as an abstract formula. But in this case, what you've labelled as the subject or as the A is actually the term that should be the B. So we get the undistributed middle when we actually have the wrong middle term. And this generates an argument that looks completely logical because it's transitive. See, B is being distributed across both premises, but it's actually wrong because we've got the wrong term being distributed, because the term that's being distributed has to be the correct predicate, right? And when you have an argument that has got the predicate and subject wrong in the first premise and has distributed the wrong middle term, it's actually illogical, but it looks completely illogical. In fact, it has the illusion of being true because you've labelled the predicate and the subject the wrong way. Take a note. Now, I don't really expect you to understand anything until you see an example. And when you see an example, this is all going to become so clear to you, okay? So let's look at this classic example here. This is what we call getting it wrong, all right? If all teachers have whiteboards and if all teachers have whiteboard markers and my mother has a whiteboard marker, therefore my mother is a teacher. Now that appears to be completely logical, but we've actually got the wrong middle term distributed, right? And anyone, there are a lot of other people in different professions that have whiteboard markers, so we know from experience that this is not true. So we can also say, hey, it's not logical. But that's really because the wrong term is being distributed, okay? And this is what we call the fallacy of the undistributed middle. It's when the wrong term has been distributed. Take a note. Right. So what we really need to do is look at a correct, properly distributed argument, right? And in this case, right, believe it or not, it is the teacher that's the predicate, even though it doesn't look like it. So if all teachers have whiteboard markers and my mother is a teacher, therefore my mother has a whiteboard marker. This time the correct term has been distributed. And don't fuss about it too much, but really the teacher is the predicate of the whiteboard marker. But we'd have to get into really complex grammar to prove that. So what do we take from this? What do we take from all this really deep kind of analysis of how the fallacy of the undistributed middle works? It really should be that the wrong middle term has been distributed. We have the wrong middle term. That's the real conclusion we should be drawing. To come up with a logical argument, you need to make sure that across premise 1 and premise 2, the right middle term has been distributed, and you have a correct logical argument as a result of it. Take a note. So what I want to point out again is that for it not to be the fallacy of the undistributed middle, the right middle term needs to be distributed across both arguments, not the wrong one, and which will lead to a proper conclusion. Take a note. So there, it's pretty clear to see, with denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, and the fallacy of the undistributed middle, it's really easy to see how you can get logic wrong. You can kind of get the structure of logic wrong. You can use it in a wrong way. For me, these fallacies here just get a little bit grey. Sometimes I really do think that they are cognitive biases, and sometimes I think they are logical fallacies. So I want you to go away and research these. They're in your textbook, but you can also just go Google them as well and take notes on what they mean using the ELQ, the exam-like question that I've created for you right here. Okay? So go write down their definition, provide examples, right? And you'll be able to kind of get a sense of what they are just quickly looking at this. The is-ought fallacy, I'm just going to give you the really brief definition of it. It's when you derive prescriptive statements or things that you should do from statements that are descriptive. It's like saying, well, everybody thinks that it's right, therefore it is right. Well, is that a logical conclusion, right? The ad populum fallacy, again, I've come up with another is-ought fallacy. The strongest shall survive, therefore we shall let the strongest survive. Again, it's an is-ought fallacy. Just because something works a particular way in nature doesn't necessarily mean that that's ethically or morally correct. The ad populum fallacy is pretty easy to understand. It's basically this assumption that if everybody believes something is correct, then it's correct. The ad personam fallacy is when you get confused for your own personal feelings and biases about a subject and you let them influence the conclusion that you've made. There are causal fallacies, again. So this one here is more like a fallacy of... this is more like a cognitive bias. This is more like a cognitive bias. This one here is more of a fallacy. I want you to go away and define what we call the ad post hoc ergo propter hoc. You can look that one up because I think it'll be fun. You can look up what we call the confusion of correlation for causality, and you can look up the inverse causality fallacy, okay? The next one that you need to go look at is the fallacy of equivocation, which I love. It basically says if there's a confusion in meaning, have you kind of come up with a fallacious argument? And then, even better, have a look at the Amphibolo Fallacy, which is a more specific example where grammar leads you to making illogical mistakes. Like, for instance, I was in Africa and I saw an elephant in my pajamas. What was he doing in my pajamas? That's basically a joke. You should be laughing at that. And last but certainly not least is the ad hominem fallacy, which so many people are guilty of. And briefly, it means attacking the person, not necessarily the logic of an argument. All right. So fill out that for me, pretty please. What have we done today? What have we achieved? Well, our first success criteria was to name and define what a logical fallacy is, which means that we have basically done that. We've basically gone ahead and we've said a logical fallacy is a misuse of logic that leads to erroneous conclusions, okay? We've named and defined many different types. The key ones that you need to know, like the back of your hand, and they're so complicated, is the affirming the consequent, the denying the antecedent, and the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Then you should really know basically all those fallacies that I've told you to go and independently research. Have you looked at examples of it? Yeah, for instance, we looked at the fallacy of the denying the antecedent. Antecedent is the first term in the first premise. If my dog only barks at intruders and my dog is not barking, therefore there is no intruder, we know that that's a logical fallacy because there could be many other reasons for why your dog's not barking. So that doesn't mean there's not necessarily an intruder. That's the denying the antecedent argument. And you can see the rest of them in there, okay? So we should be at around about a 4 for all these success criteria because we've covered them. Thanks for listening. This is probably the most complex part of the logic unit. Next thing we're going to have is a test. See ya.